The year had been a whirlwind for Ben and Lisa. After celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary with friends and family, Ben was convinced he had it all: a beautiful home, a thriving small business, and a loving, dependable wife. But lately, something felt off. Lisa had grown distant, her once animated laughter at the dinner table replaced by a distracted silence. It wasn't until the family dinner a few weeks ago that a seed of unease began to grow in Ben's mind. His father, Charles, a charming man in his 60s with a wit sharper than any knife, had come over. Charles had always been the life of the party, and Lisa had always enjoyed his humor. But that evening, Ben noticed something unsettling. Lisa laughed at Charles's jokes a little too enthusiastically. She lingered in conversation with him even as Ben left the room. When she poured Charles a second glass of wine, her hand brushed against his, and they shared a fleeting look that sent a chill down Ben's spine. He tried to shake it off. After all, Lisa had always been kind to Charles, and Ben knew he could be overthinking. But the feeling persisted. As the weeks went by, Ben started noticing small changes in Lisa's behavior. Her phone, once casually left on countertops, was now glued to her side. She began making excuses to go out more frequently, often claiming she needed space to work on a new art project. One evening, as Lisa claimed she needed to step out for inspiration, Ben's mind raced with doubts. Unable to hold back any longer, he slipped into her studio. The canvases were untouched, dust gathering in the corners. Ben didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of the unraveling. Ben couldn't let the unease go. He told himself he wasn't the jealous type, but Lisa's sudden secrecy gnawed at him. He hated the person he was becoming: anxious, suspicious, and restless. Late one night, unable to sleep, he began scrolling through old photos on his phone, looking for memories that might comfort him. Instead, he found a video from the family dinner weeks ago. In the video, Lisa and Charles sat close, their heads tilted toward each other. Ben's sister, Emily, who was recording, had panned the camera across the table as everyone laughed. Ben paused the video and zoomed in. Lisa's hand was on Charles's shoulder. At first glance, it seemed innocent, but her fingers pressed against him in a way that felt oddly intimate. Ben's stomach tightened. Determined to find clarity, he began watching Lisa more closely. Her artistic outings started coinciding with times Charles would mysteriously drop by the house when Ben wasn't home. Once, Ben arrived earlier than expected to find his father sitting in the living room, Lisa in the kitchen preparing coffee. "Hey, Dad," Ben greeted, trying to mask his discomfort. "What brings you here?" Charles grinned, the easy, affable smile Ben had known his entire life. "Just thought I'd stop by. Lisa said you'd be late, so I figured I'd keep her company." Lisa peeked out of the kitchen. "Your dad was telling me some stories about his college days. You never mentioned how wild he was." Ben chuckled hollowly. "Guess it didn't come up." The rest of the evening felt like a slow grind of suspicion and doubt. Charles left shortly after, and Lisa seemed unusually cheerful for the rest of the night. Ben's mind churned with questions. Was he reading too much into innocent interactions, or was something deeper happening? He resolved to test the waters, to see how Lisa would react if he brought up the time she spent with Charles. The next day, as they sat down at dinner, Ben casually asked, "So, did my dad tell you any other college stories yesterday? You seemed pretty amused." Lisa's hand froze over her plate, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Oh, nothing much. Just the usual antics. He's got away with storytelling, doesn't he?" Ben nodded, his suspicions hardening into something heavier. Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Every interaction between Lisa and Charles replayed in his mind, each glance and touch gaining new weight under the scrutiny of doubt. One afternoon, while Lisa was out, Ben decided to do something he'd never imagined himself doing. He went through her phone. At first, there was nothing. The messages were mundane, filled with exchanges about groceries, upcoming bills, and a friend's baby shower. But as he scrolled further, he noticed a conversation with an unsaved number. Most of the texts were short, questions about schedules, cryptic comments about timing, and even some photos of what appeared to be restaurant dishes. Ben felt his breath hitch as he recognized the wallpaper in one of the images. It was from a restaurant he and Lisa had gone to once, but the photo was taken recently. He checked the number against his own contacts. It didn't take long for the truth to slap him in the face. The number belonged to his father. The blood drained from Ben's face. The next few hours were a blur. He tried to rationalize what he'd found. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe there was some innocent explanation for the messages and the photos. But deep down, he knew better. Later that evening, when Lisa returned, Ben struggled to act normal. "How was your day?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain even. "It was fine," she replied, barely meeting his eyes. "Ran some errands, worked on my art." "Did you happen to stop by that bistro downtown?" Ben asked casually, referencing the restaurant from the photo. Lisa froze for a split second, her eyes darting to him. No. Why?" "Just curious," he said, offering a thin smile. That night, as Lisa slept, Ben lay awake staring at the ceiling. He had hoped for denial or confusion, anything but the evasive hesitation she had shown. He realized he needed more proof. Something definitive. Something he couldn't ignore. Ben's determination hardened. He couldn't confront Lisa or Charles without undeniable proof. If he was wrong, the accusation could destroy his family. But if he was right, he didn't want to think about it. The next day, Ben took the afternoon off from work. He waited until Lisa left for one of her outings, then followed her. He stayed far enough behind to avoid being noticed but kept her car in sight. Lisa's car eventually pulled into a park. Ben parked a safe distance away, slipping into the shadows of a walking trail that led to an open pavilion. He crouched behind a cluster of bushes as Lisa exited her car, glancing around as if checking for anyone. Moments later, Charles arrived. Ben's heart pounded as he watched the scene unfold. Charles stepped out of his car and approached Lisa. She smiled, a smile Ben hadn't seen in months. They embraced, their hug lasting longer than seemed appropriate. Ben's stomach churned as Lisa took Charles's arm, leading him to a bench under the pavilion. They talked quietly, their heads close together. At one point, Charles reached over, brushing a stray strand of hair from Lisa's face. Ben clenched his fists, his body trembling with anger and disbelief. He pulled out his phone and started recording. Suddenly, Lisa leaned in and kissed Charles on the cheek. Ben's breath caught. Charles hesitated but then cupped her face, turning her kiss into something far more intimate. It was as though time stopped for Ben. He couldn't move, couldn't think. All he could do was watch as the betrayal played out before his eyes. As the kiss ended, Lisa rested her head on Charles's shoulder, laughing softly at something he whispered. The warmth in their interaction was undeniable. Ben stopped recording, his chest heaving. He had his proof, but the weight of it pressed down on him like an avalanche. Quietly, he retreated to his car. Driving away, he realized the hardest part was yet to come. That evening, after Ben had gathered his thoughts, he knew it was time. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore, no matter how painful. He was going to confront Lisa and Charles. He waited until Lisa returned home. She was carrying groceries, humming a tune as she walked in through the front door. Ben stood in the living room, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, his jaw clenched. Lisa paused when she saw him. "Ben? What's wrong? You look—" "Sit down, Lisa," Ben interrupted, his voice cold and steady. "We need to talk." Her smile faded. She set the groceries down on the counter, her eyes narrowing with concern. "Okay, what's going on? You're scaring me." Ben didn't waste time. He pulled out his phone and played the recording of Lisa and Charles under the pavilion. She went pale as the footage played, her hands trembling slightly. "Explain this to me," Ben said, his voice low, but filled with fury. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Ben, I didn't mean for it to happen." Ben shook his head in disbelief. "Didn't mean for it to happen? You kissed my father, Lisa. You're cheating on me with my father." Tears welled up in her eyes as she stepped back, her voice shaky. "I never wanted to hurt you. I swear. It just happened." We were both lonely, and Charles, he was there for me in ways you haven't been. He understood me when you didn't. Ben's heart shattered, but he refused to show weakness. How long has this been going on? Months, she confessed, her voice barely audible. At first, it was just innocent. Just talking, getting to know each other. But somewhere along the way, it crossed a line. Ben could feel the anger boiling over, but he pushed it down. You crossed a line with my father. This isn't just an affair, Lisa. This is a betrayal of everything we've built. Lisa collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I'm so sorry, Ben. I never meant for this to happen. I don't know how it got so out of control. Ben stood still, watching her crumble. He could feel his whole world falling apart, but something inside him snapped. You don't get to apologize. You've ruined everything. I trusted you, and you betrayed me with the one person I never thought would hurt me. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Ben turned and walked out of the room, his fists clenched. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't stay in this house with the woman who had torn his heart into pieces. Ben couldn't stop thinking about the confrontation with Lisa. Her tears, her excuses, it all felt hollow. But what gnawed at him more was the betrayal by his own father. Charles had always been the man Ben looked up to, his role model. The betrayal wasn't just infidelity. It was a knife to the back, delivered by someone he trusted implicitly. The next morning, Ben called Charles. We need to talk. Alone. Charles hesitated on the line. Ben, I'm not sure. Don't even try. Ben cut him off. You owe me this. Meet me at the diner on 5th in an hour. When Charles arrived, he looked older than usual, his confident demeanor replaced by unease. He slid into the booth across from Ben, avoiding eye contact. Ben wasted no time. How could you? He asked, his voice laced with fury and heartbreak. Charles sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. I'm not going to defend myself. What I did was wrong. I failed you as a father, Ben. I let my own selfish desires cloud my judgment. Selfish desires? Ben spat, leaning forward. You slept with my wife. My wife, Dad. How do you even begin to justify that? I can't, Charles admitted, his voice low. I wasn't thinking. We connected in a way I hadn't expected, and it spiraled. I didn't mean for it to happen. Ben scoffed. You didn't mean for it to happen? That's the best you've got? You kissed her, you touched her, and you're telling me it was an accident? Charles looked away, guilt etched on his face. It wasn't an accident, Ben. It was a mistake. A terrible one. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Ben slammed his fist on the table, drawing the attention of a few nearby patrons. You're damn right you'll regret it. You've destroyed this family. Do you even understand what you've done? Charles finally met Ben's eyes. I understand. And if I could take it back, I would. But I can't. All I can do now is try to make it right. Make it right? Ben repeated bitterly. You can't fix this, Dad. You've broken something that can't be repaired. Charles reached out, but Ben pulled back, his body stiff with anger. I don't want your apologies. I want you to stay away from me. From Lisa. From my life, Ben said, his voice cold. Charles nodded, his face falling. If that's what you need, I'll respect it. Ben didn't respond. He stood, threw some cash on the table, and walked out of the diner without looking back. As he got into his car, a storm of emotions swirled inside him. Anger, heartbreak, and the crushing weight of betrayal. He'd thought confronting Charles would bring him some clarity, but all it had done was deepen the wound. The days after his confrontation with Charles were a blur for Ben. He had asked Lisa to stay with a friend for a while, needing space to process the betrayal without her presence in the house. Every room seemed tainted by the memories of her and his father. Ben avoided calls and messages from both of them. The pain was too fresh, the wound too raw. He turned to his work, throwing himself into projects to keep his mind busy, but even that offered little relief. One night, he found himself sitting in the darkened living room, a bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator. He scrolled through the photos on his phone again. Pictures of anniversaries, vacations, moments where Lisa's smile had felt genuine. Now, every smile seemed like a lie. Ben reached out to his sister, Emily. She was one of the few people he trusted to talk to about this. Ben, she answered groggily. It was nearly midnight. I need to talk, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. About Lisa? She asked, her tone sharpening with concern. And Dad, Ben admitted. Emily fell silent for a moment. What happened? Ben hesitated, then spilled everything. The suspicious moments, the recording, the confrontation. By the time he finished, Emily was silent on the other end of the line. I don't even know what to say, she finally managed. Dad, Lisa, both of them? How could they? That's the question I've been asking myself, Ben said bitterly. Do Mom and Dad know you found out? I confronted Dad already. He tried to apologize, but there's nothing he can say to fix this. Emily sighed. I don't know how we're going to face him at family gatherings now. What the hell was he thinking? Ben's voice cracked. He wasn't thinking about me, that's for sure. Emily offered to come over the next day, and Ben gratefully accepted. He hung up the phone, feeling slightly less alone but still burdened by the weight of betrayal. As the night stretched on, Ben made a decision. He would no longer be a passive victim in this mess. If Charles and Lisa thought they could destroy his life without consequences, they were sorely mistaken. Revenge wasn't in his nature, but this situation had changed him. If they wanted to burn bridges, he'd make sure they were scorched to ash. The next morning, Emily arrived at Ben's house, her face etched with worry. She hugged him tightly, sensing the turmoil in her brother. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I can't believe this is happening. Ben pulled away, offering a weak smile. Thanks for coming. I need someone to help me think straight. They sat at the kitchen table, steaming cups of coffee between them. Emily listened as Ben vented his anger and heartbreak, nodding silently as he pieced together his emotions. I want to make them pay, Ben said, his voice low but firm. Emily frowned. Ben, I get that you're hurt, but revenge? What good is that going to do? It's not about feeling good, Ben replied, staring into his coffee. It's about making them understand the weight of what they've done. They didn't just hurt me. They destroyed everything. Emily sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. What are you thinking? Ben hesitated, then leaned in. I want to expose them, make sure everyone knows what they've done. Dad's always been the golden boy of our family, and Lisa. She's always been admired by our friends. I want that image shattered. Emily's eyes widened. You're serious? Completely, Ben said. Emily looked torn. I get where you're coming from, but this could get messy. Are you sure you want to go down that road? I don't have a choice, Ben said. They didn't just cross a line, they obliterated it. They should feel the consequences of their actions. Emily nodded reluctantly. Okay, but let's be smart about this. No rash moves. Ben nodded. I've already started gathering evidence. The recording of them at the park, text messages from Lisa's phone. I'll collect more if I need to. Then, when the time is right, I'll make my move. Emily looked uneasy but didn't argue. She knew Ben's resolve wasn't something that could easily be swayed. I'm with you, Ben, she said softly, but promise me you'll be careful. Don't let this consume you. Ben offered a small smile. Don't worry. I've got this. As Emily left later that afternoon, Ben sat alone with his thoughts. He opened his laptop and began piecing together the fragments of evidence he had, building a case that would leave no room for doubt. If Charles and Lisa wanted to betray him, he'd make sure their betrayal wasn't forgotten. Ben threw himself into his plan with a determination he didn't know he had. Each day brought a renewed sense of purpose. The hurt and anger still gnawed at him, but now it fueled him, pushing him forward. First, he needed more evidence. The recording from the park and the texts were a good start, but he wanted something irrefutable, something they couldn't deny or spin. Ben decided to install a hidden camera in the house. If Lisa and Charles were bold enough to meet there while he was at work, he'd catch them red-handed. It wasn't something he was proud of, but pride had no place in his crumbled life anymore. The following day, Lisa came to pick up some of her things while Ben was at work. He had anticipated this and set the camera up beforehand. As expected, Charles arrived shortly after. Ben watched the footage later that evening, his stomach twisting into knots. Lisa and Charles sat on the couch, talking in hushed tones. At one point, Charles took her hand in his, and she leaned against him. They stayed like that for a while, talking and laughing softly. But what came next was the dagger. Charles leaned in and kissed Lisa. It wasn't a fleeting kiss. It was passionate, filled with a kind of intimacy that made Ben feel like an intruder in his own home. Ben slammed his laptop shut, his chest heaving. He had all the proof he needed. Now came the second part of his plan, exposing the truth. Ben started by calling his family. He invited his siblings and extended relatives to a family meeting at their mother's house, claiming it was important. His voice betrayed nothing of the storm brewing inside him. Next, he reached out to Lisa's close friends. They were people Ben had come to know and respect over the years, people who would be just as shocked as he had been to learn the truth. Finally, he crafted a carefully worded email to Charles. It included snippets of the evidence he had collected, along with a blunt ultimatum. You'll have 48 hours to come clean to the family, or I will. The choice is yours. Ben sent the email and waited. The silence was deafening. Lisa texted him repeatedly, asking why he wasn't responding to her calls, but Ben ignored her. Charles, unsurprisingly, didn't reply to the email. Ben didn't expect him to. As the 48 hours ticked down, Ben prepared himself for what came next. His family deserved to know the truth, even if it meant tearing everything apart. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel like a hero. All he felt was a cold resolve. The day of the family meeting arrived. Ben's stomach churned as he parked outside his mother's house. He wasn't sure how this would play out, but he knew it was necessary. Inside, the air was thick with curiosity. His siblings, aunts, uncles, and cousins had all gathered, each one exchanging confused glances. Charles was seated near the window, his usual confident demeanor replaced by unease. Lisa wasn't there. Ben had made sure she wasn't invited. "All right, Ben," Emily said, breaking the silence. "What's going on?" Ben stood, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Charles, who avoided his gaze. "I've brought you all here because there's something you need to know," Ben began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "It's about Dad and Lisa." Charles stiffened. The room grew silent. Ben pulled out his phone, opening the recording from the park. "I didn't want to believe it myself, but the proof is right here." He placed the phone on the coffee table, pressing play. The room filled with murmurs and gasps as the video played. The images were clear. Charles and Lisa in the park, sharing an intimate moment. Ben didn't flinch as he watched his family process the betrayal. His mother's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Emily's expression hardened, and several of the men in the room exchanged angry glances. Charles stood abruptly, his voice trembling. "Ben, this isn't the place." "No," Ben interrupted, his voice sharp. "This is exactly the place. They deserve to know what you've done." "Is this real?" one of Ben's uncles asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. "It's real," Ben said, pulling up the texts and the footage from his home as further evidence. "It's all real. My father and my wife betrayed me." Charles tried to defend himself, but his words were drowned out by the growing outrage in the room. "How could you do this, Dad?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking. "To your own son? How could you stoop this low?" Charles looked around, his face pale. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake." "A mistake?" Ben shot back. "Mistakes don't last for months. Mistakes don't destroy families." The tension in the room was suffocating. Charles tried to speak again, but Ben held up a hand. "You've said enough. You've ruined enough." With that, Ben picked up his phone and walked out. The sound of his family's voices, some angry, some heartbroken, followed him as he stepped outside. That evening, Ben sat alone in his house, the adrenaline wearing off. He didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. But for the first time in weeks, he also felt like he could breathe. The truth was out, and the burden was no longer his alone to bear. The fallout from the family meeting was immediate. The news spread quickly through their close-knit circle, and Ben's phone buzzed incessantly with messages of shock and support. His siblings were furious with Charles, and his mother refused to take his calls. But it wasn't long before Lisa came to him. 2 days after the revelation, she showed up at the house. Ben was in the backyard, trying to clear his mind by working on a long-neglected garden bed. "Ben!" Lisa's voice broke the quiet. He turned to see her standing at the gate, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with red. She clutched her bag tightly, her hands trembling. "What are you doing here?" Ben asked coldly. "Please," she said, stepping closer. "I need to talk to you. Just for a minute." Ben hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Fine. Say what you need to say." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "I know you're angry, and I don't blame you. I've made the worst mistake of my life, and I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to fathom. But please, Ben, don't throw everything away." "Everything?" Ben repeated bitterly. "You threw everything away the moment you decided to betray me with my father." "I wasn't thinking clearly," Lisa said, her voice cracking. "I was lost in Charles. He was there when I felt like I couldn't talk to you." Ben's anger flared. "Don't you dare try to put this on me. I was your husband, Lisa. I trusted you, and you chose him over me." She shook her head vehemently. "It wasn't like that. I didn't choose him. It was a mistake. A terrible, horrible mistake. I'll do anything to make it right." Ben laughed bitterly. "Make it right? There's no fixing this, Lisa. You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed my relationship with my father, too. How do you think I'm supposed to move past that?" Lisa stepped closer, reaching out to touch his arm. He pulled away. "I'll go to therapy. I'll leave town if that's what you want. I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm still the person you fell in love with," she said desperately. Ben shook his head, his voice cold and final. "The person I fell in love with wouldn't have done this. That person doesn't exist anymore. You and my father can live with the consequences of your actions, but you're not a part of my life anymore." Lisa's tears fell freely as she realized the weight of his words. She opened her mouth to say something, but Ben held up a hand. "Leave, Lisa," he said firmly. "There's nothing left to say." She hesitated for a moment, her shoulders shaking with sobs, before turning and walking away. Ben watched her leave, his chest heavy but resolute. For the first time since the betrayal, he felt a sliver of peace. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. After Lisa's visit, Ben thought he might finally get some peace, but the ripple effects of the revelation were far from over. Charles, who had always been a pillar of their family, was now the source of its collapse. Word spread quickly among friends and extended family. Invitations to dinners and gatherings dried up for Charles, and his social circle began to crumble. Even his longtime business partners started distancing themselves, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with his betrayal. Ben didn't take any pleasure in his father's downfall. Despite everything, there was still a part of him that mourned the relationship they once had. But the pain outweighed the nostalgia. One evening, Charles showed up unannounced at Ben's doorstep. Ben opened the door and froze, staring at his father. Charles looked worn and defeated, his usually sharp appearance disheveled. "What do you want?" Ben asked, his tone cold. "Can we talk?" Charles pleaded. "Just for a moment?" Ben considered slamming the door in his face, but stepped aside instead. "Make it quick." Charles entered the house cautiously, as if he didn't belong there anymore. He sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. "I've lost everything, Ben," Charles began, his voice breaking. "Your mother won't speak to me. The family, everyone's turned their back on me. And I don't blame them. I don't blame you." Ben remained silent, his arms crossed as he leaned against the wall. "I know what I did was unforgivable," Charles continued, "but I don't want this to be the end. I don't want this to be the last time we speak." Ben's jaw tightened. "And what do you expect me to say? That I forgive you? That we can just go back to being father and son? You destroyed that bond the moment you touched my wife." Charles winced as if the words physically hurt him. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Truly sorry. For everything." Ben scoffed. "Sorry? You're sorry because you got caught. Because your perfect image is ruined. If you really cared about me, you wouldn't have done it in the first place." "I don't expect you to understand," Charles said, his voice trembling, "but I was lost too. After your mother, and I drifted apart. I felt, I don't know, empty. And Lisa, she was there. Ben shook his head, disgusted. So your excuse is loneliness? That's pathetic. You don't get to ruin my life because you were empty. Charles looked at him, his eyes filled with regret. I've made mistakes, more than I can count. But I don't want to lose you, Ben. You're my son. Ben's voice was ice cold. You should have thought about that before you betrayed me. The silence between them stretched for several moments. Finally, Charles stood, his shoulders slumped. I won't bother you again, he said quietly. But if there's ever a day you're willing to talk, I'll be here. Ben didn't respond. He simply opened the door and waited for Charles to leave. As the door closed behind his father, Ben exhaled heavily, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. For Ben, this wasn't closure, but it was another step forward, one more piece of his broken life dealt with. With both Lisa and Charles out of his life, Ben thought he might begin to heal. But the anger still simmered beneath the surface. The betrayal was too deep, the wounds too fresh. He couldn't let them walk away unscathed. He began crafting a plan, not one born of impulsive rage but of calculated intent. He would ensure Lisa and Charles faced lasting consequences for their actions. The first step was Lisa's reputation. Over the years, Lisa had built a modest name for herself in the local art community. Ben knew how much she valued her standing, how much she prided herself on being admired and respected. Ben gathered the evidence he'd collected, the texts, the video from the park, and the footage from their encounter in his home. He carefully packaged it into a file and anonymously sent it to several of Lisa's acquaintances, including members of her art collective. He didn't add commentary or embellish the facts. The evidence spoke for itself. Within days, whispers began circulating. Lisa's involvement with her husband's father became the talk of the community. Galleries that had once been eager to feature her work suddenly distanced themselves. Invitations to events were rescinded. Lisa called Ben repeatedly, her voicemails alternating between pleading and angry. How could you do this to me, Ben? You've ruined everything. Ben never responded. Next, Ben turned his attention to Charles. His father's betrayal had shattered their family, but Charles still had one thing he cared about, his career. Charles was a senior partner at a prestigious firm, a position he had worked decades to achieve. Ben knew the firm valued its reputation above all else. Through an anonymous tip, Ben sent the firm's board of directors a copy of the evidence. He made no demands, just provided the facts. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Charles was summoned to an emergency meeting, and within a week, he was forced to resign. His reputation in the business community was tarnished, his legacy irreparably damaged. Despite the success of his plan, Ben didn't feel triumphant. Revenge hadn't healed him. It hadn't erased the pain. But it had given him something he desperately needed, a sense of control in the wake of chaos. For the first time in weeks, Ben slept soundly. The days following Ben's calculated revenge were quieter than he anticipated. Lisa and Charles, once fixtures in his life, seemed to have faded into the background, their worlds crumbling under the weight of his revelations. Lisa's attempts to contact him dwindled, though not before she left one final voicemail. Her voice was hoarse, weighed down by desperation. I know you hate me, Ben, and I probably deserve that. But I loved you once. I still do in some way. Please believe me. I'll leave you alone if that's what you want. But I need you to know I never meant for it to end like this. Ben deleted the message without hesitation. Charles, true to his word, stayed away. Ben heard through family channels that his father had moved out of town, selling his home and retreating to an isolated cabin upstate. Some family members called Charles's actions cowardly. Others believed he was finally taking accountability by removing himself from their lives. Ben wasn't sure he cared either way. At work, Ben found solace in routine. His colleagues noticed the change in him, a sharper focus, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. Though they didn't know the full story, they respected his resilience. Still, the nights were hard. The silence in his house was deafening. The memories of a life once filled with love and laughter haunting every corner. Emily continued to visit, offering support and a much-needed outlet for his thoughts. You did what you had to do, she reassured him one evening as they shared a bottle of wine. They deserved everything that happened. Ben nodded, but didn't respond. He wasn't sure if he believed it anymore. Revenge had given him a temporary sense of power, but it hadn't erased the ache in his chest. One morning, Ben received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Charles. He hesitated before opening it, unsure if he wanted to read whatever his father had to say. But curiosity won out. The letter was short and to the point. Ben, I've lost everything, and I know it's because of my actions. I don't expect forgiveness or even acknowledgement, but I wanted to say this. I'm sorry. For everything. I failed you as a father, and I failed as a man. I hope one day you find peace, even if it means never hearing from me again. Charles. Ben read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. He didn't have the energy to respond, and maybe he never would. The cracks in Ben's life were still there, but he was beginning to see glimmers of light. He started thinking about moving out of the house, starting fresh somewhere far from the memories that haunted him. The pain was still there, but so was the resolve to rebuild. Months passed, and the storm that had engulfed Ben's life began to subside. The scars of betrayal remained, but they no longer consumed him. Slowly, he pieced himself back together, finding strength in the wreckage of his old life. He decided to sell the house. It was a painful decision, but staying there felt like living inside a wound that wouldn't heal. The memories of Lisa, of their love and its destruction, lingered in every corner. Moving away wasn't just about leaving the house. It was about reclaiming his freedom. Emily helped him pack. As they boxed up his belongings, she teased, "Time to trade this place in for a fresh start. Maybe somewhere with a better dating pool." Ben laughed for the first time in what felt like ages. "I think I'll stay solo for a while. I need to figure out who I am again before I jump back into anything." "You'll be okay," Emily said with certainty. Better than okay. On the day of his move, Ben stood outside the house, taking one last look. It was bittersweet. This had been his home, his sanctuary, and the site of his deepest heartbreak. But now it was just a building, a shell of what it once meant to him. He got into his car and drove away without looking back. Ben relocated to a small, quiet town a few hours away. The new place was modest but cozy, with wide windows that filled the rooms with light. He spent his days fixing up the space, making it his own. It was therapeutic, giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. He joined a local hiking group and rediscovered his love for nature. On the weekends, he explored the nearby trails, finding peace in the rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds. One day, while hiking, he met someone, a woman named Claire. She was kind, funny, and unassuming. They struck up a friendship, bonding over their shared love of the outdoors. Claire didn't pry into his past, and Ben appreciated the simplicity of their connection. For the first time, he felt a spark of hope. On a quiet evening, months after his move, Ben sat on his porch, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined him. He realized something profound. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had been done to him. It was about freeing himself from the weight of anger and regret. He wasn't sure if he'd ever forgive Lisa or Charles, but he was learning to forgive himself for staying too long, for trusting too much, for breaking down when he needed to be strong. As the sky turned to twilight, Ben smiled. His story wasn't over. It was just beginning.